Okay, let's talk a little bit about how we're going to tweak our asset in the hair viewer. Just a little bit of a UI tour here. We've got an output window, which currently really only has the viewer version and the SDK. We've got our attributes window for our hair nodes, and then our display tab, which has information like scene visualizers, lights, and display mesh organization. Our main toolbar has the play transport and quick controls that we're going to use, like your animation list, wind noise, wind strength, preview LD, and reset simulation. So to bring in our asset that we made in Maya or Max, we're going to open up an FBX file. And in this case, we're going to go ahead and deal with our Maya version of this for the example. Open up the FBX file, and that's going to bring in all of the meshes that were associated in that FBX file, both skinned and unskinned. And the first thing that you'll notice is that the hair viewer sensed the correct up axis, which is Y. We could set it to Z if we want, but we're going to stay with Y. Our navigation style is based off of Maya or 3ds Max, and we did this so that it would feel familiar to you as a user. There's no reason to reinvent the wheel when something already works well. We can do things like show the grid for our ground plane, our axis indicator, our statistics heads-up display, which can also show various stats for the hair under compute stats and compute profile. And then we've got our visualizer for our wind direction. We can change the background image if we so choose to desire, there to see your character in even more context with your game. And we've got various types of mesh rendering, so wireframe, flat, shaded, wireframe over, and then textured, which we'll get to textures here in a moment. We've got our lights. We can visualize our light direction. So we can go ahead and bring in the distance a little bit. We can change our light intensity, fall-offs, shadows. We can go ahead and add some more lights. We'll enable it. So we can get some nice 3-point lighting. We'll go ahead and add a rim light, enable it. Oops. There we go. And to move the light around, I'm just holding control and using my left mouse button to rotate the light. I'll bring the intensity down on that last rim light. And now we're done with our lighting. Now you can see we have this display meshes section, which is also controlled by this show graphics mesh. So if I turn that off, I'm basically turning off all my display meshes. If I say use skin meshes only, that's only going to give me the meshes that are skinned to a bone, not any accent static meshes. So as far as setting up materials on this stuff to put your character in more context, if you have your textures in the same directory as your FBX file, and your FBX file reference those textures, it's going to try to connect those automatically. In the event it's in a different directory, like I have it set up here, then what we need to do is just go in and add some textures. So we'll go to textures, and we're dealing with the body of the character. So we'll grab the skin, and go ahead and grab the specular. And I can go ahead and grab the normal map too, which is why we needed to export this with tangents. And you can go ahead and adjust anything you want about this. Diffuse scale, ambient scale. We can go ahead and change the specular a little bit. And then you can kind of move on and do your other objects. So we've got our platform to work with. And so pretty quickly we can create something that's contextual to our game, just with our FBX file. And at this point, what you would do is you can go off and you can save your scene as a project file, which is going to be just a .fir proj. So we can just call this demo. And now our progress is saved. So now what we want to do is add a hair file to this. And so we can do this from the general attributes section on the hair tab, or we can go over to our file menu, say open hair file. And we're just looking for our APX, and we're working with our Maya version for this demo. And so now we've pulled in our hair. Now you can see our hair doesn't have any color to it. It's got some basic attributes set, and that's because we need to connect our textures. So what we'll do is go to root texture, and we want to grab our root color and our tip color. We can adjust the weight. Each of those influence the strands. So we'll go just under half for this guy. Diffuse Blend is going to control how much this tries to blend with the shader on the skin. And then, of course, we've got our speculars. So, for example sake, I'm going to use a really bright green. And I'm just going to go ahead and turn this up a little bit so you can see how the primary specular only is hitting the fur. And I can change how tight that is. I can make it really loose or really tight. I typically like to make my primary pretty tight. And then I'll bring it down a whole lot. And then we've got our secondary scale, so we'll make that really bright. We can make that really loose by making a lower value. And then we can offset that from the first highlight. So we'll just find an area that looks good from this camera angle. Say somewhere around there. And we'll bring our intensity down. There we go. Then we'll give this a more meaningful color to the character. So we'll say a nice cool bright blue. So we end up somewhere around here. And you can see as it shimmers in the wind that we're getting nice little specular shifts that help the hair look like hair. Speaking of the wind that I just mentioned, if you hold down Shift, you can change the direction of the wind, and the wind strength and wind noise is applied up in our toolbar. And this is a global setting that's going to affect all of the hair assets loaded in the scene. So if you have more than one hair asset loaded, it's going to control all of those. However, wind is set on a per asset basis if you wanted to get into it and set those individually. However, it's generally something you want to be consistent across your character, hence it's up here. If you wanted to see the wind manipulator, again, just turn the manipulator on. You can see what direction you're going. And make it really strong, really weak. And let's keep on moving down our attribute list. Then we've got shadow attenuation, enable hair shadows, and this is hair to hair shadows, and then body to hair shadows, which would be any other meshes and how they're affecting the shadows. And we can go ahead and turn that attenuation up. End up somewhere around here. And we'll look at level of detail here in a second. Let's go ahead and move to our physical materials. So for our physical materials, we can control a lot of things that affect the behavior of the material, such as the volume, and the strand width, stiffness, clumping, and waviness. So you've got a lot of control. And anytime you see one of these texture boxes, you can feed it a black and white texture that's going to multiply against your constant value, which is pretty similar to Maya or Max or a lot of other visual effects tools. So the first thing to play with, obviously, is the mass scale. So you can change the weight of the hair, make it real heavy, or we can do reverse gravity. We can go ahead and turn our damping off in this case. And backstop. To explain backstop, let me go ahead and turn off all of the stiffnesses that I have. So if I turn all the stiffness off, you can see that the character has the hair kind of falling through some areas. Backstop is essentially identical to backstop in our clothing module in that it's a series of spheres that approximates where the skin meshes by making a wall of these spheres kind of along the surface. So if we turn this up, it's going to use the average edge length for the mesh to kind of create this. So you can see it pushes the fur out a little bit, but it keeps it on the outside of the mesh. So when the character is moving around, you're not getting bald spots just randomly appear. So we'll set that about there. And then for our density, you can see here if we turn on the guide curves that we don't have curves where we didn't groom them in our DCC package. It's only where we actually wanted to have curves. Well, this gives us a pretty good approximation of where density should be, but we really want to blend things in a little better. We don't want this harsh line here where there's no fur and then fur. So what we do is we paint a density map, and that density map kind of gives us a little bit of a fade off to those items. So you can see here we're thinner where the rib cage is and on the outside of the arms and blending into the face. And then that multiplies against this float value here, so we can be as dense or not dense as we want. Now, if by default this is sampled on a per vertex level, but if we wanted to go a little more fine detail, we could go in the UV space and do that per pixel. It's a little more expensive to do this way, but if you really wanted to, you could. The other thing that we can control is length noise. So if I turn off the simulation and turn length noise all the way down to 0, you can see we just look very uniform in our interpolation. Length noise is going to vary that so it looks a little bit more ragged and a little bit more natural. Length scale we can also control with a texture map, and that's how long the groom actually is according to the guide curves. And in real time you could just grow hair. Strand width is what it says it is. We can define a root width and a tip width. So we'll take our tip width down to 0 and our noise down to 0. And then our scale is a global multiplier over both of these values. So I can just up the entire width. And being that our tip is 0, that's going to stay at 0, and our root's just going to get bigger. So we'll keep it a little bit thin. If we add some noise to it, that's going to change the widths a little bit so that we've got some variation in those so they're not all so uniform. Now I'm going to turn the simulation back on, and let's talk a little bit about the stiffnesses. Let's give us a little bit more density. Root stiffness is just that. It's just going to help with the stiffness or the fall off from the tip for the base of the hair strand, the bottom half of it. And then global stiffness is eventually just going to bring us all the way back to our rest shape. And generally a combination of these two can help you keep your style preservation and your silhouette value. In this case, I also want to be able to drive the stiffness with a texture because I really only want it to be stiff on the main. So I'm going to go to my global stiffness and add a texture for stiffness. Then globally, I want to add a little bit of root stiffness. So I end up somewhere in this ballpark. We can also get into clumping, change the clumping pattern of the hair. If we go less than 1, we're getting kind of a concave clump, and if we go above 1 in the 1 to 2 range, we're getting a convex clump. We can scale how intense that is. So if we go down really far, we're kind of getting a little bit of a wet look. And then we can add noise to that. Then the next thing to look at would be waviness. So if I want straight hair, I'll just pull waviness scale down to 0. But we don't want that in this case. We want it to be a little mangled. So we'll go to 0.8. Like to add a lot of noise to the fur so that it doesn't ever feel uniform. Your frequency is how many waves we're trying to get through the length of each strand. You can see if we do a whole lot, it just kind of zigzags around, looks really frizzy. I've found for this guy 1 3/4 seems to be pretty good. Again, we have noise to control this so they're not so uniform. And then we have this attribute called root straighten, and what root straighten does is it straightens out the base of the strand. You can see down here in this region what's going on. So that only the tip of the strand is wavy or curly, and this operates on about the bottom 30 to 50% of the strand. Now I've already got this set up in another project with all the full materials and the final tune or the close to final tune. So I'm going to go ahead and open that project up. And about the only thing I really want to change here is the ambient values on the fur. So I'm just going to go back here and bring that down a little bit. And maybe bring the shadows up. Now some things to do with visualization. While we're playing it, we can actually reset the simulation on each loop, so when it reaches the end of the frame, it'll just start over again. But we want it to be continuous, so we'll set it back this way. For our texture maps, let's say we wanted to view what the density map actually looked like on the character. Well, we can view this very easily. We'll turn off the hair, and we'll turn on the growth mesh, and then let's look at the density map. Now you can see we're overlaid against the graphics mesh, so I just have to go over here and turn off show graphics mesh, and now I can see exactly what these things look like against my character. I can look at the stiffness map. I can look at the root color and tip color, which I guess I don't have root color loaded, so let's go ahead and load that real quick. There we go. So that's a root color. It's pretty close to the skin. Then I can just go ahead and shift that back to none, and I can turn my hair on, turn my graphics meshes back, and the growth mesh off. I can look at the visualization points if I wanted to, or the knots that are in the guide curves. We can look at the shadow map. We could look at the tangents on the hair, or the normals as they pertain to hair. And we can also look at the various LODs. So let's talk about LOD just a little bit. So I'm going to turn on distance LOD. And I'm going to go down here in my level of detail rollout, and let's preview LOD. And the difference between preview LOD and enable LOD is enable saying that I want to use this on my asset, and preview is saying that I only want to preview it right now while I'm tweaking my asset, because it's not always convenient to have that turned on while you're trying to edit just a neutral look of the character. So now that I have preview turned on, what I can do is just zoom out, and it's going to change to red and then fade out. So continuous LOD, what's actually happening here, let me turn the visualization back to none, and we'll go ahead and play the character while I'm talking, is that the base width of the character, or the strands on the character, are getting thicker while the density becomes less and eventually going to 0. And you can choose how this happens so that it makes sense for your game. So let's say we only wanted it to start at 500 units and you want it to end at 1200 units. And you can just kind of work with it in real time. So there's no stair-stepping or plateaus of different LOD levels that are going to kind of pop into existence. And instead what you're having is individual strands coming in and out, and therefore blending the entire look of the fur. So we'll set this back to 750 and 250. And then the exact opposite is true for detail LOD. So we have a start distance and then an end distance that's closer to the camera. And what's going to happen is as you get closer, the furs are going to get thinner and they're going to get more dense for your close-up shots. So let's go ahead and pause the animation. And as we go in, it's fairly seamless. You can see we're populating and getting more hairs. And those new hairs are a lot thinner too. The idea is that it's seamless. We'll turn off our LOD and just go back and hit play. And then when you're done tuning your character, you go to your general attributes and save the current asset. And if you want to save the progress in your Fur Viewer project, go to Save Project. And then you can, from here, take your asset into the game engine.